Thank you very much for the round of floor speeches. Now we move back to the paper speakers. The second speaker for the proposition is Tilly Middlehurst. Tilly is a second-year student studying HSBS at Fitzwilliam College and won the right to speak through audition. You have the ears of the House.
Sorry. Thank you for having me. In the spirit of Halloween, I'd like to invoke the scariest name of all. Ronald Reagan famously declared... Ronald Reagan famously declared that the most fear-inducing words are, "I'm from the government and I'm here to help." I'd one-up him on that, and I'd say, "I'm from the American government and I'm here to help," strikes me with far greater terror. So today I'll justify my belief that we ought to understand the decline of the United States as a necessary process in which the US makes space for other actors to assert influence. As the sun sets on unipolarity, I assert a few things in defense of my understanding that this is a net positive. Primarily, I claim that by the time we have to truly worry about a new balance of power, we will no longer live in a world where the decline of one will necessarily lead to the ascension of an unchecked communist threat, right? Secondly, I assert the truth. Authoritarian states are outnumbered and outmanned by democracies. If the opposition is right, and on this point I believe they are, that the world over is deeply concerned regarding the outcome of a less powerful United States, a coalition of interests will generate an appropriate response to potential foul play from countries with the ambition to step into America's spotlight. Finally, I note that one cannot lament the decline of an America that exists in the imagination of Americans only, and those individuals who ascribe to a number of myths. If we're to regret or oppose America's decline, we must come to terms with the reality that there has never been a United States champion of human rights and democracy in coexistence with United States global hegemonic superpower. But even if you don't think any of this is true, I ask you whether you prefer a world with checks and balances on something powerful over one without. One in which a nation, likely not your own, determines your fate or something else does. And yes, no thank you, I'll be taking on the hefty burden of defending the legitimacy of global and effective accountability mechanisms. And I'll do so because people instinctively oppose any form of gigantism. They think the bigger the network of individuals, the larger the regulations imposed, the less protections they ultimately gain. I aim to prove today that in cases such as this one, reality plays out in the exact opposite direction. An unaccountable state is a bad state. The US is not unique in its self-interest. I don't seek to demonize it. I operate politically as a left-wing individual who is sometimes accused of spoiled brat anti-Westernism, other times defamed as a neo-colonialist. What I accept is that good values and good ideas sometimes come from the West, and we ought to preserve those values. What I lament is the idea that the staunchly pro-American camp are here to defend them, or that their characterization of a world without American global hegemony is a world with Chinese dominance. With that being said, I'll start with my first and most important claim, that this debate is not about whether or not evil China, or maybe even evil Russia, is going to take America's spot and then do worse things than the United States would do. Why is this? Well, firstly, because the Cold War was a cause of enlarged diplomatic institutions that arose as guardrails to protect the ideological victory of the US. It's implausible then to suggest that history merely echoes in the background as the United States loses its global standing. Good collaboration, good institutions, and particularly good ideas, which are what I'm most interested in, are here to stay. I must challenge the extent to which America and the West are responsible for the dissemination of good Western values, but for now I'll deal with the all too important reality of what comes next following this decline. To do this, I must address the non-existent clash at the heart of this debate tonight, right? That America is on the decline at all, that we're dealing with the motion happening in the present. I therefore would agree with our last opposition speaker on this aspect, and the impassioned floor speaker who, as an American, informed us of how powerful the US is, and it's the truth. The US conquered the world with the dollar. Nearly all 195 countries are dependent on it in some way. Chinese currency only makes up 2.5% of world reserves. The euro is at 21.2. The SWIFT international payment network, owned in large part by the US, who has major skin in the game here, is the main avenue for the processing of almost every single electronic payment in world trade. Militarily, the US has the most powerful weapons, the most inflated military budget, and more bases around the world than anyone else. As Biden, before his lobotomy, roused, America never bows, it never bends, it never breaks. We're America second to none. We own the finish line. Similarly, Simultaneously, the unipolar order is indeed coming to an end. This is sophisticated Aristotelian philosophy, which states that two things can exist at once, right? It's not because America is floundering internationally, despite its deeply disturbing problems and occurrence domestically. The threat of a nationwide ban on women's right to choose, the election of a potential insurrectionist held liable in court for sexual abuse. Unipolarity is ending because other states are gaining momentum, not because America is in the near future going bust, right? So what does the composition of global power look like then? Well, if we examine the regional composition of the global top 10%, we find the share of top 10% income holders coming from particularly East Asia has increased steadily since 1950, and that North American dominance within the global top 10%, it's still stark. If we're to measure the power of states through a Marxist prognosis, if we're looking at which individuals compose the very wealthy, we find the same general pattern for the regional composition of the global top 1%. Relations between what in international studies we describe as the center with the periphery demonstrate that state powers who are dominating economically will organize the international division of labor in a way that best suits their interest, whereas periphery states, especially those as mentioned by opposition in sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia, are relegated to less productive activities which require less equipment, less human capital. What I'm trying to demonstrate here is that the persistence of a US-led global hierarchy in the present remains even as power dynamics begin the process of diversification. Why am I making the point that the decline of America is definitely not happening yet if it's already been made? Well, I'm doing so because it sets the groundwork for my premise here that by the time a potential new replacement to the United States demands our attention, we'll no longer operate within a system characterized by one power's decline, triggering the unchecked rise of another, especially not an autocratic one. Reliance on trade is important, and the more globally and therefore multipolar the world looks, the more this will happen, which is a good thing for obvious reasons, right? You don't want any one state to monopolize an industry entirely. But I say even if China does become isolationist, which realistically, China's the only country that is also a global power contender, which might attempt it, the country's going to crumble due to the crises it's already suffering from demographically and geographically. See how I'm not predicting a world of harmony here, but rather a fiercely competitive one, where states operate under the principle that unchecked actions have consequences, and that would include North America. The norms that emerge in this world are not moral imperatives, they're practical necessities. I believe this is possible, not only because the data I just presented in regard to countries catching up to the West deems it inevitable, but also because the dynamics of the Cold War altered international politics forever, insofar as it's a product of identities locked in enmity that had formed through hostile interactions and were ultimately changed. In fact, Mearsheimer himself predicted that once the Soviet Union dissolved, NATO would follow suit. By 1989, after 4 decades of interactions, member states' relationally contingent identities had changed, obviously, and NATO continues to shift its goalposts dependent upon whatever contemporary issues the international community faces today. So I think this ought to teach us a lesson about what it means for states to operate on the basis of collective interest. The illusion that US hegemony brings peace, whereas multipolarity does not, is one I seek to disprove. I seek to dispel this myth through my second claim, which is that the characterization of America so often invoked is smoke and mirrors. It's asserting the existence of an ideal type, proclaiming the purpose of the United States is to do what it's consistently failed to do. As such, though I accept it's entirely possible that the country could fulfill the role of defender of democracy and freedom now, I don't see any evidence that it plans to. So I, rather radically, base my understanding of what America is and its values look like on recent history and what it's doing in the present. In fact, I think it's necessary that the United States does decline such that it can, if it so chooses, act as the opposition characterizes in the future, i.e. a force for good, part of a coalition of state interests. The US hasn't maintained its status as the most powerful country by being the most moral or ethical, but because it's the most ruthless cutthroat machine. This is why, when I hear about the uniquely American values of democracy and freedom, I wonder what specifically the US has to offer in that regard. The US granted women's suffrage after New Zealand, Australia, Finland, Norway, Denmark, Iceland, and Russia, abolished slavery only after 8 other countries did the same. The Global Peace Index ranks China 40 places higher than America. I'll take the point, though. Yes? Yes?
The reason we're sitting here tonight is that US influence, as flawed as it was necessary to get Europe out of the situations of the First and the Second World War. I think it is deeply disingenuous to claim that the period of multipolarity we had in Europe at that time didn't lead to anything other than totally brutal conflict and the near swallowing of Europe by totalitarianism, fascism, and communism.
That's why I'm making a future projection. It's exactly why I make a future projection. I don't focus on the past of multipolarity because it was based on European balance of power politics, which is obviously very different to what's going to come in the future, insofar as better global accountability mechanisms happen on account of the fact that the Cold War has happened, right? So I already characterized that because of the Cold War, these identities locked in enmity have changed, and therefore the World War stuff is less relevant, right? So just to conclude then, I think that, Milton Friedman expresses the US foreign policy approach nicely when he contends that profit-making is democracy, that any government pursuing anti-market policies is therefore anti-democratic, that it's the job of the United States to overthrow democratically elected governments in the interest of stability. It's why the Allende government in Chile, which enjoyed significant popular support, was overthrown with vigor. It's why Colombia's domestic wheat industry was decimated, leading to nationwide drug problems. It's why Bolivian water was privatized, a coup incited by the CIA in Guatemala. It's why the Venezuelan government and oil firms were blocked from accessing international credit markets. It's why authoritarian regimes in the Middle East, Saudi Arabia, and Egypt are supported for their role in maintaining stability. It's why the US protected time. It's why the US has a uniquely terrifying relationship with Israel, whereby the ethno-state can commit atrocities with unconditional support, because a stable Israel is a buffer of Western influence in the Middle East, a buffer that secures oil flows essential for the American economic interest, because America never bows, it never bends, it never breaks, it owns the finish line. Don't fear multipolarity, fear the only state that can't be contained, and it's not the East. I'm very proud to propose.